Did you know that a small area of New York City once changed the face of American culture? Yes, we're talking about Harlem, a place that was once a quiet, forgotten slum, but in the 1920s, the neighborhood exploded with a buzz that can still be heard today. The Harlem Renaissance was an explosion that gave new life to African-American identity, sparking a revolution in poetry, music, theater, and literature that has never waned. It wasn't just an art movement, it was a spiritual awakening. Even after a century, its ripples are still visible in today's arts, fashion, and thought. So let's turn back the wheel of time and head to 1910 New York, where a new world was being born. America was changing after World War I. Industrial development was booming, but the chains of racism were still tight in the southern states. African Americans wanted to escape the shadow of slavery and live a life of dignity. This search forced them to migrate north in what history remembers as the Great Migration. More than 1 million black citizens left the South and settled in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. A new neighborhood began to grow in the Harlem area of New York. This neighborhood became the center of dreams that had been suppressed for centuries. Dreams that were about to be given color, sound, and words. The early days in Harlem were not easy. Poverty, unemployment, and the walls of discrimination still existed. But behind those walls, a lava was boiling. The lava of creation. People began to come together in community centers, churches, and on the streets. Songs, poetry, and stories became their identity. They began to mold the pain of their past into words and melodies. It was not just an expression of grief, but a collective declaration. We too are beautiful. This was the moment when Black Pride was founded. Harlem nights were now different. Jazz began to resonate in nightclubs. Musicians like Duke Ellington would perform at the Cotton Club, and white spectators would watch in amazement as this music reached their hearts. Louis Armstrong would tell a story of emotions with his trumpet that would reach every heart even without language. This jazz was not just music, it was a declaration of freedom. In every note there was the pain of centuries, and in every rhythm the fragrance of a new dawn. At the same time, poetry was also at its peak. Langston Hughes, one of Harlem's brightest stars, filled his poems with the colors of black life. The words of one of his poems still resonate today. I, too, sing America. These words were not just poetry. They were a cry, a declaration, and a hope. Langston said what thousands were thinking but afraid to say. Her poetry taught the youth of Harlem to be proud of their identity. Zora Neale Hurston, another name associated with the story of Harlem, brought the voices of Southern women to life in her stories. Her words had both the sweetness and pain of folktales. She would say, I love myself when I am laughing, and then again when I am looking mean and impressive. Zora's stories became symbols of self-knowledge. As a woman, a black person, and a human being, she proved that literature is not just for men or the powerful, but for all who have the heart to speak. Not only art, but politics were also breathing in this golden age of Harlem. The New Negro movement, an ideology that became the basis for African-American pride and self-confidence. Thinkers like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois showed new paths for education, unity, and racial equality. People began to feel proud, not ashamed of their color. It was the first time an entire generation considered itself new, with new ideas, new dreams, and new possibilities. Stories began to be told in Harlem's theaters. Institutions like the Harlem Experimental Theater emerged, where actors for the first time began to play roles that were connected to their original stories. This was unusual for the time, because before that, African-American characters had often been the subject of satire or humor. Now they were telling their own stories, from their own perspective. Theater had a greater impact on the heart than language. Typewriters clinked in the mornings on the streets of Harlem. Writers, artists, and musicians were all busy with their own art. This was not just a cultural activity, it was a quiet revolution. Newspapers like The Crisis and Opportunity became platforms for new ideas. The writers in them were young people, no longer afraid. They were telling the world that we are America, and so is our story. In Harlem's art studios, pictures spoke. Painters like Aaron Douglas created a new visual language by combining African heritage, religious symbols, and modern style. His works like Aspects of Negro Life still speak in museums today. How color, light, and shadow could tell an entire history. Harlem artists were painting history, not just aesthetics. This movement was not limited to art. It gave an entire generation a sense of self, a belief that resonated in politics, society, and the economy. Newspaper articles began to appear saying, Black Americans must no longer be just workers, but leaders. These words ignited a spark in the hearts of the people. Harlem had become more than just a place. It was an ideology. Another magician was emerging in the music world, Bessie Smith, known as the Empress of the Blues. There was a pain in her voice that touched every heart. Her songs told stories of slavery, love, and freedom. People said that when Bessie sang, all of Harlem fell silent. Her songs spoke of both the strength and pain of women. The special thing about the Harlem Renaissance was that it was not just a class movement, but a movement of the entire community. Poor workers, educated students, poets all came together. Churches, clubs, and schools all united for one goal, to regain their identity. It was this togetherness that made it an unforgettable era. When jazz played on the streets of Harlem, boys and girls danced, smiled, and became part of a new culture. It wasn't just entertainment, it was the announcement of a new way of life. Smith. Swing, blues, and ragtime, every tune exuded self-confidence. The major cities of America began to adopt jazz after seeing Harlem. This was the moment when black music gained global recognition. Harlem writers recorded social realities. Claude McKay's poems and stories reflected the racial contradictions in America. He wrote, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot." These words became a slogan of protest. Literature had now become the language of the oppressed. With the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, the American media also highlighted black artists for the first time. Their interviews, artworks, and stories began to be published in magazines. Faces that had previously been in the background now came to the center. This change was not just artistic, but also political. Harlem's nightlife was at its peak. Savoy Ballroom, Cotton Club, Apollo Theater. These were the places where history was being written every day. Music, dance, and poetry mingled together. The difference between people's color would temporarily disappear. For a moment, everyone would just become human. The role of female artists during the Harlem Renaissance was also unparalleled. They stood alongside men and participated not only in art, but also in social awareness. Through them, the voice of African American women reached the world. This was the first step in the feminist consciousness that later became the foundation of black feminism. But with every movement comes criticism. Some critics said that the Harlem Renaissance was limited to only one class, that the poor class was still experiencing the same challenges. Other researchers said that the movement was more about art than politics, and that it should be seen as a cultural celebration rather than an ideological battle. Still, the doors that this movement opened were never closed. Harlem artists proved that creativity is not confined to race or circumstance. Their words and melodies began to connect generations. This was the moment when black identity entered global. After the Harlem Renaissance, the music of America changed forever. Jazz, blues, and later rock and roll all have their roots in this movement. Every new singer, every composer is somehow influenced by this golden age of Harlem. Writers did not retreat either. After Harlem, black writers established their own literary identities rather than becoming part of American literature. Names like Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Maya Angelou inherited this tradition. All of them were extensions of the Harlem Dream. The Harlem Renaissance also transformed white America. They no longer considered African American culture just folklore. They saw it in the mirror of art, philosophy, and truth. This acceptance was the first spark of a greater social revolution. Time passed, but the light of Harlem did not fade. When the civil rights movement took off in the 1950s and 60s, its slogans and anthems echoed Harlem. Martin Luther King's speeches echoed the same pride, the same hope that once hid in the notes of jazz. Today, when we listen to modern art, rap, or hip-hop, the spirit of Harlem beats in it too. Black culture is now a global culture, and its foundation was laid by the dreams of Harlem that were seen in a small area a century ago. So think, if there had been no Harlem Renaissance, would America be what we know today? After the Harlem Renaissance, a new question arose. Was this movement just about art, or also about political awakening? This era was the first conscious declaration of the liberation of the black mind, says historian David Lewis. According to him, poetry and jazz were not just entertainment, they were the language of protest. While some critics, such as Henry Louis Gates Jr., believe that the Harlem Renaissance brought African American intellectuals into the American mainstream, it was a cultural revolution that gradually transformed into political power. Many Harlem artists were not directly vocal in their politics, but every word in their art had the scent of resistance. A jazz tune, a poem, a painting, all of them were a mirror to white society. A mirror that said, "We will write our story, not yours." It was a declaration of independence. That is why the Harlem artists shook the foundations of American consciousness. Around the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the Crisis magazine, wrote a famous phrase, "Art is propaganda and must serve our cause." That is, art is not neutral, but has a purpose. This idea became the intellectual foundation of the Harlem Renaissance. Every artist, every poet was giving a message through their work of racial equality, self-reliance, and the search for identity. One aspect of the Harlem Renaissance was that it honored African heritage. People no longer saw Africa as just a past of slavery, but as a source of cultural pride. African symbols began to emerge in clothing, music, and art. This was cultural reclamation, a journey back to one's roots. This same spirit was later reflected in the Afrocentrism movement. The artists of the Harlem Renaissance did another thing. They changed the meaning of Americanness. Previously, American culture had been understood to mean only white tradition. But after Harlem, the face of America became diverse. Jazz, blues, and black art proved that the American soul is divided into colors. This was the moment when the seed of black is beautiful was sown. Harlem's literary circles were also history-making. In addition to the Cotton Club, Niggerati Manor was a house where writers, poets, and musicians would gather to plan for world change. Here, minds like Zora Hurston, Langston Hughes, and Walter White would debate all night long whether art should be a part of politics. These debates are a testament to the intellectual depth of this movement. Harlem's streets were not just places of entertainment, they had also become educational institutions. The younger generation, who had previously felt inferior, now began to write, sing, and paint themselves, inspired by Harlem's artists. It was the beginning of a generation generation's self-discovery. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, Harlem's glow began to fade. Many clubs closed, artists moved to other cities. But the movement was not over. It had taken root in hearts. Harlem's dreams had now spread across America. He showed people that art could be more than just entertainment. It could also be a social force. When World War II broke out, young Harlem men joined the army. But they also took their identity to the battlefield through their art. They sang songs, poems, and posters for freedom and equality. Thus, the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance lived on in the slogans of war. After the war, the civil rights movement arose in America. The teachings of Harlem Renaissance artists have now become a torch for the leaders of the new generation. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks were all heir of Harlem's intellectuals who put the spirit of this movement into politics, religion, and public struggle. They turned the power of art into a weapon of social justice. Harlem had no longer been a historic place, but had become an ideological symbol, a metaphor that became a symbol of oppression, self, and hope. The voices of Harlem's streets are now echoing globally. Freedom movements in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America have also been encouraged by Harlem's artists. Jazz, which was once limited to nightclubs, has now become the language of the whole world. Poetry, which was once a protest, had now become part of world literature. The effects of Harlem are also alive in modern times. When we listen to today's rapes, Spokane words, or hip-hops, their words are the same protest, and the same pride that was ever in Langston Hughes' poems and Bessie Smith's songs. Modern artists such as Kendrick Lamar, Beyoncé, and Jay-Z are the heirs. Of the same tradition, they are not just considered fun, but used as a political and social statement. In today's Harlem, the same spirit is still breathing. The streets still hear jazz lyrics. The same colors are scattered on the walls that were sometimes created by Aaron Douglas's brushes. But above all, there is still the same passion, the spirit of knowing and telling the world your truth. Harlem Renaissance proved that when a nation puts its suffering into art, it is not just alive, she becomes immortal. That is why Harlem is still not just a place, but a feeling, a light, which burns in every heart that believes in freedom, identity, and humanity.